Fresno, California, 1941 ամսուն օգոստոս.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Can you hear me? Great. Welcome to this evening's presentation on behalf of the Armenian Studies program. We're happy to have you here. And as you've been seated here, you've seen some of our upcoming events. We have quite a few events still coming this semester on a wide variety of topics, including our upcoming presentation next Friday night at 5 o'clock in the evening in the same hall. Richard Hagopian will be performing. Richard is right here in the front. This presentation is actually part of the series co-sponsored by the Middle East Studies program here and the Global Music program here at Fresno State. Then the week after that, on March the 7th, which is a Thursday night, Dr. Ara Sanjan is coming from the University of Michigan at Dearborn, and he's going to give us an up-to-date view about the changes that have been taking place in Armenia, the so-called Velvet Revolution, which took place last year. And he'll detail the background of that, what's happened, and then what's happening now. In other words, what's the last 6 months that the new people have been in power in Armenia. On Monday, the 11th of March, we're going to have Vahe Tashjan coming from Germany to talk about the Hushamadyan project. The Hushamadyan project details the history of the Armenians before the genocide. It's a website called hushamadyan.org where it takes different regions, and there are photographs, articles, music from each of the different regions in Armenia. And if any of you have artifacts, photos, music, anything interesting in that way, we can scan that for you and send it, and you can put it up on that website. But he'll be talking about that project on Monday, March the 11th. On Friday, March the 15th, we're going to have one of the foremost scholars in the world on the Armenian genocide, Dr. Taner Akjam, who will be visiting from Worcester, Massachusetts, Clark University. And last year he published a book called The Killing Order of Talat Pasha, where he uncovered new material about the genocide and about the responsibility for that. We're going to hold that in our big hall, the Satellite Student Union. So make sure to tell everybody about that. We want to have a big turnout for Dr. Akjam. And we'll also have his book for sale. It's the brand new book called The Killing Fields. That takes us right through March. March 17th will be the Armenian Studies program banquet. And in any of these events, you can follow us on Facebook and on our webpage. And if you want more information, you can always call us or take a look at it. Yes?
Barlow, I was calling the Cineculture today, and they still didn't have
yes, on March 29th, we're going to have an Armenian film in Cineculture, but we're still in the works with getting that done. Tonight, also, I want to introduce Steve Adams, who is the commander of the Knights of Bartan local Yeprat Lodge, who has an announcement about an upcoming banquet as well. Steve?
Well, we couldn't let Barlow announce this one. If you were watching the slides up there, you would have seen it. Would have been slightly embarrassing. But the Knights and Daughters of Bartan are recognizing a Man and Woman of the Year. If I had my act together, I would have done this at the last lecture because both of them were here. The Woman of the Year is going to be Stephanie Barugin, and our Man of the Year this year is Professor Barlow Demirgidichin. The banquet is Saturday, March 30th. It will be at Fort Washington Country Club. I have reservation cards up here, and I think there's some on the desk out there. So if you want a reservation card and a little place to email or mail it back to, you can see me, and I'll make sure you get it. These are two, I think, very extremely deserving individuals in our community who deserve to be recognized for their work, both Stephanie and Barlow, for the work that they've done in our community. So we're looking for a great turnout for both of them. So if you want to make reservations, see me, or you can pick these up at the desk out in front.
It is an honor to be recognized by the Knights of Bartan, Knights and Daughters of Bartan. So thank you, Steve, and to both organizations. So I'd like to introduce our speaker tonight, but first I'm going to put up the PowerPoint, the first part of it. So we'll do that. So let me introduce our guest tonight. Our guest is Dr. Christopher Sheklian. He's a native of Visalia, and actually, as I look around, and many of you are friends and family from the area, Visalia, Yetem area, and I think actually his parents are here, and I want to recognize them, Myron and Debbie Sheklian. Dr. Sheklian's presentation tonight is quite interesting because he's actually done work as an anthropologist in living in Turkey, in Istanbul, and studying in particular the Armenian community and how the Armenian community intersects with the Turkish community, especially considering how few Armenians are left, but also considering the differences and similarities between Islam and Christianity. And in particular, he's going to take a case study of an Armenian church, the St. Gregory Church of Kuzguncuk, which is near the Bosphorus, and it's a church which right next door a mosque has been built. And the relationship between the Armenians and the Turks is kind of intersecting because those services often take place at nearly the same time. I'm not going to tell you more. He'll give you the introduction on the presentation. Let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Sheklian. He is currently the director of the Krikor and Clara Zorab Information Center. That is an information center which is associated with the Eastern Diocese of the Armenian Church, and it is located at the diocese in New York. He is also an ordained deacon in the Armenian Church, which also fits in with his work as an anthropologist, studying religion, and especially he defended his thesis on the title of Theology and the Community, the Armenian Minority, Tradition, and Secularism in Turkey. And he graduated with his PhD in anthropology from the University of Chicago. As I mentioned earlier, he's done 2 years of field work, ethnographic field work in Istanbul. He specializes in the anthropology of religion and secularism, and especially studying the role of liturgy and law on the lives of religious minorities. Some of what he'll talk about tonight will be about the laws which are applied to the Armenian community by the Turkish government and how the Armenians negotiate that interaction. He's a very active scholar. He's published articles, and he is also continuing to pursue research on secularism, religious minority rights, and the embodied and emotional aspects of religious life. I was thinking this semester about how to bring different types of people, different types of lectures, and bringing to Fresno State, to our campus, people that we haven't seen before, and especially younger scholars. So it's my pleasure to introduce tonight our guest speaker, Dr. Christopher Sheklian. Dr. Sheklian.
Thank you, Barlow. Thank you very much for that very wonderful and kind introduction. How's my sound? Am I okay? Am I close enough? Okay, good. Very good. Yeah, thank you. I first want to say thank you to Barlow de Bergadician and to Sergio Laporta, the Armenian Studies program here at Fresno State, for inviting me. You know, it has been said that a prophet has no honor in his hometown, but looking out at friends and family, I'm both absolutely thrilled at the support and also a little more nervous than I usually am, I would say, seeing that and thinking about that. So it is an absolute treat to be here at Fresno State, so thank you for the invitation. One afternoon after Badarak, the Armenian Divine Liturgy, the Mass, I was practicing some of the deacon's parts of the service with the young man who led the choir at the little church of St. Gregory the Illuminator, sub Krikor du Savoric, in the neighborhood of Kuzguncuk in Istanbul. Though almost exactly my age, his musical skill far exceeds mine, as anybody who has sung or served with me would know, and I was happy to have the help. We were going over a melody for a litany, a request intoned by a deacon from the morning service, when the muezzin from the mosque next door began to recite the early afternoon call to prayer. You can hear the two happening together. And you can also hear that the choir master was really not fazed at all. He notes the muezzin's voice. He says, and it's kind of cool, it's a mix of Turkish and Armenian, and he says, the imam's voice is coming. Don't worry about it. And then he continues. And in fact, the two melodies are not really discordant. To an extent, they align. One might even be tempted to say that they were harmonious. So when we look at this picture with this little seaside church, what do you notice? We've said it, but here's the church. Yeah, so the minaret from the mosque is right next to it. And in fact, you can't tell in this angle, but the grounds, the properties, share a wall. So not the church, not the building itself, but so, you know, if you think about some of our churches, right, there are other buildings, maybe gates or whatever. So the complex, the property, shares a wall with the mosque's properties. So you can understand why we might hear it as we were practicing. With the harmonious blending of the music emanating from two different houses of worship, the mosque and the church, the wavering is on, the call to prayer, mingling with the slightly nasal singing, which is characteristic of Istanbul Armenian liturgical singing, we have a metaphor for what we might call the most optimistic version of Armenian life in Turkey, right? This sort of harmonious mixing. Now, we know that harmony is not the only possibility, right? Discord is often the rule. Many Armenians feel a kind of acoustic tyranny when they hear the call to prayer. Loudspeakers blast the call to prayer across the city where churches are often deprived of bells. Many churches are sequestered behind walls rather than sharing them with mosques. Yet whether harmony or tyranny, we can hear faintly emerging the melody of our two themes for tonight, property and liturgy. At a bare minimum, liturgy, which I'll call the conventional, collective, traditional worship, in this case, obviously, the Armenian Apostolic Church, but liturgy is something that's shared across Christian traditions. Liturgy of the Armenian Apostolic Church requires the physical church, a piece of property, right? So we can see immediately a kind of connection, right? Where do we do liturgy? We do it in the church. So you need property, the church, and you need liturgy. And those two things together make a church in some ways. So we can see in here also, though, that our two themes, property and liturgy, throughout the night, we're going to see them entwine in other complex ways. So tonight my goal is to amplify these two themes of liturgy and property. If we listen carefully, I argue, we can gain invaluable insights into the Armenian community of Istanbul, of Turkey, and broadly, which is my sort of overarching theme of my research, we can get a better understanding of what it means to live as a religious minority. So first, though, let's zoom out a little bit. Today, and I suspect many of you in this crowd will know this, but let's go through it briefly here. So much of historic Armenian homeland today lies within the Republic of Turkey. The Republic of Turkey was established in 1923 out of the remnants of the Ottoman Empire, which at its height stretched across 3 continents. So this is the height of the Ottoman Empire, and it gives you sort of in different colors when things were conquered and whatever, but the furthest extent includes all of this green. Armenians had lived in what is called the Armenian Plateau, or what now is often called Anatolia, right? So just kind of this part. Well before the first Turkic groups came through the Caucasus into the region. We can see here the borders of historic Armenia and some of the Armenian kingdoms throughout the centuries, right? So you probably know about the Cilician Armenian kingdom, which you'll notice, interestingly, right, does not totally overlap with what we might call historic Armenia. But these are places where Armenians have lived that also overlapped with the Ottoman Empire. Well, some of the beautiful churches and other buildings fell into ruins over the years, with ancient capitals like Ani being abandoned a long time ago. Armenians continued to live in their historic homeland, but under Ottoman rule. They lived as what are called dhimmis, is the technical term, which is often translated as people of the book, namely Christians and Jews who were willingly submitted to Ottoman rule, paid higher taxes for the exchange of basically sort of freedom of worship and protection, you could say, which is to say when the other empires were fighting with the Ottomans defended all of their subjects. This is in no way an equal relationship, right? These are subjects. These are second-class subjects. You pay a higher tax. But it was the system that did allow Christians, Jews, other non-Muslims to live within the Ottoman Empire. This was the arrangement, okay? They were called dhimmis, this is the status. And over time, something emerged that was called the millet system. I won't go into this for too much. I can talk about it in detail later. I've got like a whole chapter and a half on it on my dissertation, so let's not get me started, otherwise we'll be here all night. But the millet system, basically what happens is that these dhimmis, these unequal Christian and Jewish subjects of the Ottoman Empire, were given a semblance of self-administration through their religious organizations. So the Patriarchate, the bishop in Istanbul, the Armenian bishop in Istanbul, administers the Armenian community throughout the Ottoman Empire. He becomes responsible not just for their spiritual well-being, but he also does things like collect taxes on behalf of all of the Armenians, which he then presents to the Ottoman state. This becomes known as the millet system. So this is sort of what this minority population of Armenians looks like under the Ottoman Empire. And throughout the Ottoman Empire, they continued to build churches, including in Istanbul. You might recognize the cameo here. Now looking at this map though, and we can even go back to this one, what do you notice about Istanbul? Where is Istanbul on this map? Way over right here. It straddles Asia and Europe. And where's historic Armenia? Kind of over here, right? So even the Wilsonian Armenia, a very large Armenia. How about, anybody know what the furthest extent of Armenian kingdom was under who? Anybody know? Tigran the Great. Right, we can see Tigran's empire as well. You will notice that even Tigran the Great's empire did not make it all the way to Istanbul. So what are Armenians doing in Istanbul? How'd they get there, and why might they have gone there? Any ideas? Why would you go to Istanbul? Work, trade. What is it? Constantinople. Istanbul is Constantinople. It's the capital of the empire, right? There's a lot of reasons why you might want to leave the provinces and go to the capital of the empire. So over time, Armenians found their way into Istanbul. Now actually Armenians had already been there during the Byzantine Empire, during the period of the Byzantine Empire. Armenians had come to Constantinople, but in a sort of strange way, the differences between the two Christian churches actually mattered more in some ways than the differences between being Muslim and Christian. The Muslim Ottomans were sort of like, y'all are Christians, we don't understand your differences, we kind of don't like any of you equally. The Byzantines were like, okay, you're Christians, but you have these things wrong, and if you want to live in our empire, you should probably accept our version of Christianity. So actually, in some ways, more Armenians end up in Istanbul and Constantinople under the Ottomans than they do under the Byzantines. That said, there were a lot of Armenians that lived in Byzantine provinces and in the capital, and actually, there were a number of Byzantine emperors who were of ethnic Armenian descent. So Armenians have been in Constantinople and Istanbul for a really long time. But the numbers do sort of swell under the Ottomans when Armenians become traders and merchants and all kinds of things that might bring you to the capital of the empire. And so over time, a really important community of Armenians develops in the capital of the Ottoman Empire. Most Armenians during the Ottoman Empire continued to live in the provinces. Culturally, however, the capital, as they often do, exerted a kind of cultural importance. Takes on a kind of outsized role. The Patriarchate is there. So this sort of chief bishop who's administering legally all of the Armenians of the Ottoman Empire, he's there. A lot of your wealthiest traders are going to end up in the capital, because if you control the trade, even if you control it in the provinces, you're going to sort of move it through to the wealthy parts of the empire. So you've got a church ecclesial center, you have a kind of economic center, and this translates over time also to a kind of cultural dominance among the Armenians of Istanbul. Now, I've got a lot of friends and colleagues and scholars who are very keen to assert the importance of the provinces, and I don't want to play that down. Most Armenians continue to live in the east, they continue to live in the provinces. Big cities in the east like Van, Harper, Erzurum were absolutely and incredibly important. But as time goes on, and in the 19th century, when you have a kind of what's called the Zartung, this sort of awakening, this kind of cultural revival, it's really centered in Istanbul. And if you speak Western Armenian, it's sort of emerges in Istanbul. So you have a kind of literary importance and a cultural importance that comes out of Istanbul. All of this is to say that the city of Istanbul is a place where Armenians have lived for a long time and has been important for Armenians for a really long time. Okay, that's my point of saying this. Now, this continues like this, with large population in the provinces, an important cultural center in Istanbul, all the way until the genocide. With the genocide, obviously, we have the killing of over half of the Armenians in the empire. And this is actually the important thing. There have been studies recently, people like to argue about the numbers, you know, was it 1.5 million, was it blah, 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 blah. The important thing actually is no matter how you run the numbers, it almost always comes out to about half. Half of the Armenian population of the Ottoman Empire was killed. Killed. Not just the ones that are scattered, right, but killed. Okay? So, you know, not to downplay the question of numbers, but I think actually that half speaks louder than you know, a number, actually. Okay? So half of the Armenians are killed. Now, though it's April 24th, right? April 24th is the day we commemorate the genocide. Why? Anybody know why? What happens on April 24th? So all of the intellectuals, the number usually given is 215 intellectuals in the capital of Istanbul, are rounded up, marched away, and most of them are killed. A few people survive. Zabel Yasayan, one of the only women collected, escapes. Gomidas, his powerful friends, intervene for him. He lives, although he, as many of you know, sort of loses his mind and lives out many of his years in a sanatorium. Most people of those 215 are killed. The man on the right, Krikor Zorab, I picked because I am the director of the Zorab Information Center. It's his daughter who founded the center, was an author and a member of the Ottoman Parliament. Actually, there's a story that he was like playing cards with Talat Pasha the night before. So, I mean, these are important members, not only of the Armenian community, but of the Ottoman community in Istanbul. Okay? So these 215 are rounded up, marched out, most of them are executed, most of them actually just sort of disappear. We don't actually know the story of a lot of what happens of those 215. And this is the day that we commemorate the genocide. What is perhaps ironic is that after that, though, Istanbul is spared a lot of the carnage of the provinces during the genocide. Any thoughts on why?
Too much international eye.
Exactly, 100%. Right? Istanbul is the capital, so you've got embassies, you've got diplomats, you've got German officers who are their allies, you've got all of these Westerners who are sitting right there, and, you know, that's bad press to kill half of a population. It's not going to go over well, even though, you know, people didn't really know what to do about it, the German allies possibly were slightly complicit, there's arguments over all of these kinds of things. But no matter how you look at it, you don't want watchful eyes when you commit genocide. So after those initial 215, the sort of proverbial chopping the head off the Armenian community of the intellectuals, Istanbul actually then is sort of spared. And there are actually these harrowing stories of the people who did remain were totally cut off. They knew something was happening, but they didn't really know what. They didn't know the extent of what was happening to their brothers and sisters and, you know, family members and relatives and compatriots in the provinces. It was a really quite harrowing time. Even though they were spared, I mean, I can't imagine that. To know that something awful is happening, but not to know the extent of it and not be able to do anything is quite harrowing. So this is what happens in Istanbul. So the kind of mass genocide that happens in the provinces doesn't happen to the population in Istanbul. Now, when the Allies win the war, defeating the Ottoman Empire, they occupy the capital of Istanbul. Orphans and survivors pour in from the provinces during this occupation period, from 1918. So the population of Istanbul swells. There were already lots of Armenians there. Some left, some fled during the genocide because they knew something was happening, but many of them stayed. It was their home. After the genocide, a lot of people come in from the provinces, and there's a lot of work to kind of reconstitute the Armenian community, which is the topic of a really wonderful recent book by Lerna Ekmekcioglu, Recovering Armenia. I wholeheartedly recommend it. And so these orphans, people kind of pour into Istanbul while it's under Allied occupation. Now this is where history gets really sort of complicated and absolutely, in some ways, almost more tragic than the genocide itself is what happens in the aftermath of it. Because there's this glimpse of possibility for a larger Wilsonian Armenian state that doesn't materialize. So people come back to Turkey, to their homes, after the genocide. The Allies have won the war. In Cilicia, in that bottom part of Turkey, the French are occupying. So a lot of people go there. You might actually have relatives who were born in, say, Adana in 1922, after the genocide. Why? Because the French were occupying the area. It was a safe place for Armenians to go back. The other absolutely safe place to go back was Istanbul. It's under Allied occupation. So a lot of Armenians go back to these parts, and some of them try to go back further into the interior. Tragically for the Armenians, what happens though is that the Turkish nationalist movement under Mustafa Ataturk, later, Mustafa Kemal, later Ataturk, father of the Turks, does not accept the initial treaty that ends the war. They say, well, we totally screwed on this, we don't like this. So there's this kind of nationalist rebellion that basically reconquers the Anatolian heartland. They don't get that huge Ottoman Empire back, but basically what you see of Turkey today is a result of the Kemalists, which is what they were called after Mustafa Kemal, the Kemalist troops' nationalist work. The French leave Cilicia, the Greeks are defeated on the Aegean coast, the Allies leave Istanbul. A lot of the Armenians that came back realize that they are not going to do well under the new nationalist Turkish state. So you don't see a lot of people born in Adana in 1925. You see a lot born in 1921 and 22, not so much after 23. But in Istanbul, a lot of people stay. Because for many of them, it was their home from before the war, right? They were sort of spared being killed. And a lot of the people that came from the provinces, maybe you just couldn't make it all the way further out of the country. So Istanbul, in the immediate aftermath of 1923, of the establishment of the Republic of Turkey, becomes the main center of Armenian life. Now, in the first years after the formation of the Republic, there are still Armenians sort of scattered throughout the empire. Okay, so this is the map of the death marker, so to give you a sense of where Armenians were coming from. And in the years immediately following, you do have Armenians that sort of stay in the provinces. Diyarbakir, Sebastia, Sivas has a decent-sized population. Malatya, somewhere over here, maintains some population in the interior of Turkey after the genocide and after the formation of the Republic. The largest population, though, is in Istanbul. Over time, and I'm not going to get into all the details and the sort of varying awful things, I'll come back to some of them, the legal stuff, but things were not great for Armenians in the nationalist Turkish Republic of Turkey. So over time, a lot of those who still did live there in the provinces after the genocide made their way to Istanbul. They either left the country entirely or they went to Istanbul. And this happens throughout the 20th century. So you'll find a lot of people today that are in their 50s or 60s who were born in the interior of Turkey. You don't find a whole lot of Armenians who were born in the interior of Turkey who are 20. Okay? This happens during the course of the 20th century. For varying reasons, people continue to move either out of the country or into Istanbul. So today, when we talk about Armenians in Turkey, we're basically talking about Istanbul. Okay? Over the 20th century, people have moved out of the provinces. There's a few exceptions. Diyarbakir is one of the main exceptions. Tigranagert, although it doesn't actually have a connection to our Tigran the Great. Diyarbakir, Tigranagert. The times have changed since I took this picture a few years ago. But Tigranagert, Diyarbakir, a lot of it was under political control of Kurdish political parties, who now, they played a role in the genocide. We probably know this history. But in recent years, the Kurdish political movement has been a great ally of Armenians, actually. And what you see here is the entrance to the walled old city of Diyarbakir. It's actually the second longest continuous walls in the world after the Great Wall. The walls of the city of Diyarbakir form the old city of Sur. And what you're seeing here is municipality of Sur written in 4 languages. So we have Turkish, Kurdish, Armenian, and Syriac. Okay? So this is something that in other parts of Turkey were totally unheard of, and actually for varying reasons, which we could talk about later if we want, this sign has come down. But a few years ago it was possible, and actually in Diyarbakir there were some Armenians who sort of knew they were Armenian. A lot of them, as with many Armenians, were assimilated into Muslim households, often Kurdish households. So this is what has gotten a lot of press in the last few years. It's kind of a hot topic, what are called usually the Islamized Armenians. Okay? And a lot of these people have come out. There was a very famous memoir by a woman, Fethiye Sheklian, my grandmother, it was called, Anayanam, where basically on her deathbed, her grandmother told her, hey, I'm Armenian, and you're Armenian, therefore. And this was like, this woman was already an intellectual, and it sort of was like, whoa. And so then Chetin sort of follows this through. It's a really interesting memoir. So there are probably 200,000, 500,000, it's unclear, because how do you count this, of these Islamized Armenians living in Turkey today. I think we should consider these people Armenian. The Patriarchate doesn't know what to do with them, right? Because they're Muslims. What's the church going to do with Muslim Armenians? So this is a new. Only in the last decade have people been able to freely say in Turkey, hey, I'm Armenian. I'm Muslim, but I'm Armenian. Many of those are in Diyarbakir. This is the Surp Giragos Church, a large church in Diyarbakir, which was rebuilt recently, and again, there were some issues in the more recent years. We can get into that later. There's a couple other places. This is a little church in a little village that's called Vakifle, Vakiflekoi, Vakiflekyu, depending on who you ask, that sits on a little mountain that you might have heard of. Musa Dağ, Musa Ler. Okay? So you probably heard the 40 Days of Musa Dağ, Franz Werfel's famous account of the resistance of Armenians on this mountain. It's right by the seaside, and the French troops actually came and got them. And they actually went back, in part because this area was part of Syria for the first about 15 years of the Turkish Republic. Now it's part of Turkey. Weird politics that we won't go into. There is still an Armenian village, and it's a village, it's very beautiful, that is still Armenian, and here is this, I believe, a Surp Asvazazin church here. Outside of these areas, there are families, there are a few churches, but really outside of this, if we're talking about Armenians in Turkey, we're talking about Armenians in Istanbul. Besides that, Armenian existence in the provinces of Turkey really exist as ruins. This is another cameo here, and it's also what we're looking at is what is left of the monastery of Surp Garabed Mush. There were 2 Surp Garabeds, and actually because I know that I have a lot of Gesaratsi, Çomaklutsis in the audience. This is not the Surp Garabed that was close to us. It was the Surp Garabed further east in Mush, one of the most famous monasteries in all of historic Armenia. This is what we've got. This is about what's left. So before the genocide, and for many years after that, Armenians lived scattered throughout the Ottoman Empire, but today we really have them in Istanbul. We can say, these numbers are hard to say, but there's about 60,000 Armenians in Istanbul. 60,000 Armenians of Turkish citizenship. So their passport is a Turkish passport, they are Armenian. In addition to that, there's a tough to determine number of Armenians who are migrant, mostly undocumented, hence tough to count, workers from the Republic of Armenia who are working in Turkey, in Istanbul, often in home health care and things like that. So I would say that we should probably say, not counting Islamized Armenians, there's about 100,000 Armenians in Turkey. About 60,000 or perhaps less of whom are Turkish citizens. Okay? And for a long time, they were scattered all throughout the city. So this is a map of Istanbul. And these are churches. These little red dots are churches. Okay? Some of them are more sort of put together than others. Today in the city, there are 36 active Armenian apostolic churches. There are, I believe, 4 Armenian Catholic churches and 2 Armenian Protestant churches. So all of these, it's not differentiated on this map. So any of these little dots are Armenian churches. And you can see, right, that at some point, for there to be a church, obviously there was a parish, there was a community at some point. Many of these are 19th century constructions, a lot of these churches. So you can see that at some point they really lived pretty much all throughout the greater city. You can see where they were concentrated, but you can see that they were also scattered throughout the city. Now today, for varying reasons, kind of for the same factors that cause people to come from the provinces into the city itself, Armenians have concentrated in a handful of neighborhoods. So a lot of these churches, even though there's 36 active churches, a lot of them, there's 1 or 2 families that live in the neighborhood now. So there are a handful of Armenian neighborhoods that are really highly densely populated. These include, right around in here, the Kurtuluş area, over here, Samatya, and then in Bakırköy, and some of the surrounding neighborhoods is another sort of major center where Armenians are living today. Okay? So if you are walking in the streets of Kurtuluş, you will hear Armenian on the street. Okay? If you hang around long enough on the streets around there, on Kurtuluş Caddesi, you will hear Armenian. You hang around the church in Samatya on the street, you might. The Samatya Armenians don't speak as much Armenian as they do in Kurtuluş, for varying reasons. They came to the city later. A lot of them lived in the provinces for longer, so their Turkish is better. So, when I say active church, what does this mean? What do I mean by active church? Well, at a bare minimum, an active church means that when we're thinking about our 2 themes, liturgy and property, that a church is active if there is a liturgy offered there. If you have Baranak in a church, and its roof is still standing, it's an active church. You actively have Baranak there. Okay? Now some of these churches, like in these big neighborhoods, are very vibrant churches. They're really active churches. There's Baranak multiple times a week. They've got Bible studies in the evening. One of them, a bishop, comes and preaches on Thursday evenings like he is a rock star. It's amazing. You can actually, you can find Sahag Sorpozan online and listen to his sermons. They are incredible. He preaches Thursday evenings and it's a packed house. So some of these are very active churches. Some of them are active in this bare minimum, where there's Baranak there sometimes. So some of these way up here in Kartal, Armenians don't really live there anymore. And what happens is on the name day associated with the church, they'll go celebrate Baranak up there. Right? So if you are from, say, Yetem, and your church is called Surp Asvazazin, when is your name day? Hey, that's an easy one. Asvazazin. Okay? So if, say, there was a Surp Asvazazin up here, they would go, and in August, on the Sunday closest to August 12th, they would go up there and they would do Bararat. But otherwise, nothing is happening up there. It's active because they do that, but it's not active in the sense, like Bible studies, all kinds of activity. But active also resonates with our other theme, with the question of property. So from the perspective of property, an active church is a very specific legal category. And it's one that goes to the heart of the Armenian community in Turkey and in Istanbul today. So each one of these liturgically active churches is chartered as a legal entity called a vakif in Turkish. Now I'm going to do a little bit of this. This is the most technical part of what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to get it to you. If I see eyes rolling over, I'll skip a little bit. Okay? It is highly the hours I have poured over trying to make sense of what the heck this vakif thing is and how it works is mind-bending. Okay? It's like I'm not a lawyer. I don't know if Turkish lawyers understand what a vakif is. Okay? It's a very specific legal category. And it comes out of actually Islamic law. So the Turkish is vakif, in Arabic waqf. And it gets translated usually as either foundation or as endowment. And I think both of them are a little bit right. So like a foundation, right, is like a nice organization that has a bunch of money, that supports all kinds of interesting things. An endowment, right, we might have an endowed chair, which means you give a nice lump sum of money and then the interest sort of pays for that chair so that, people can teach you nice things about Armenians. Both of these kind of capture what a vakif is, but neither of them totally gets it right. So it often is translated in the literature as religious foundation. When I talk about it, I go back and forth between endowment and foundation. The way I like to describe how a vakif works is to make up a kind of imaginary example from the present day. So let's say that, I am a very wealthy real estate mogul in New York City. I wish. I own all kinds of property. I got all kinds of money. I got tall 50, 100-story apartment buildings scattered throughout the city. I'm getting old, and I'm making my will. And my eldest son, who's going to get, under Islamic law, most of my property, is worthless. There's no way I want to leave all of this property and money to this worthless eldest son of mine. Under Islamic inheritance law, what you can do is found a vakif. And what the vakif says is that I'm going to take some of these apartment buildings, maybe 3 of them. I'll give a couple to my son, he's not that worthless. But I'm going to take some of them, and I'm going to charter them, and I'm going to say that in perpetuity, the rent money from those apartments are going to support, I don't know, the Eastern Diocese of the Armenian Church, because we're in New York City. Okay, so in perpetuity, I'm going to set up a kind of little board. My son might be on the board, and maybe 5% of the revenue will go to my son and his family. 10% of the revenue of the rent will go to the maintenance of the buildings themselves. The rest of the rent money goes to the Eastern Diocese in this case. This is basically what a vakif is, okay? And part of what makes vakif confusing is that people use it to talk about both the property that is revenue generating, so those apartment buildings, and they also use the word vakif to talk about the object of the revenue, in this case the diocese. So if people were to talk about, say, the Surp Vartanas church in Ferikoy, and you say the Surp Vartanas vakif, you might mean the church. You might mean Surp Vartanas, the church. But you also might mean this big bundle of revenue-generating properties, which many people have donated. Not just me, but other wealthy landowners have also donated a couple apartment buildings. And this gets grouped together in this big legal bundle that in perpetuity supports the Eastern Diocese or Survarkanaz Church or an orphanage or any kind of charitable object. Okay, so the vakif is all of these things lumped together. This is part of what makes it confusing. It's both the revenue-generating property, these apartment buildings, and the charitable foundation itself, whether that be a church, an orphanage, whatever. Okay? So this is what a vakif is. Now, you'll see here that this comes out of Islamic law. It's based on the Quran. It's based in injunctions to charity. And it develops over centuries as an Islamic legal category. Now wait a second. How does this have anything to do with Armenians? Well, it's a really weird question. And in the Ottoman Empire, and you do see them also in Mughal India, you don't, I think, see them in Persia. So it's not uniform across the Islamic world. But in the Ottoman Empire, over time, Armenians and other non-Muslims were allowed to use this legal device. They said, all right, charity doesn't, charity isn't just charity to Muslims, charity is charity to anybody. So as long as you are creating a charitable foundation, your object of your revenue-generating property is charitable, fine. You can make one of these vakifs. We'll let you do it. So Armenians were allowed, and other non-Muslims, were allowed to use this weird legal category. And they did. Problematically, they often did so in ways different from the rest of the Muslim foundations. So when Muslims chartered an Islamic vakif, there was a specific way they did it. They wrote up the legal agreement, the imam signed it, it says, my son gets this, he's worthless, he only gets 2%, the well at the mosque of, this, ayah so-and-so, gets the rest of the money. And it's a very clear legal document. The founder's name is there, the object is there, everything is clearly spelled out. Now when Armenians did this, they often, because these were often already existing churches that people were supporting. People were like, hey, my village church is not looking great. My revenue-generating property is going to go to my village church. I want that thing to keep being sustained. I want there to be a priest there. Let's support it. But often, because they were already existing, they would charter them like in the name of a saint. So you see non-Muslim Armenian vakifs whose charters don't say, Amira, Dadian gave this money. It says, the Holy Virgin, Blessed Asvazazin, has chartered this vakif. So this is one sort of weird thing that happens. The other thing is that while Armenians and non-Muslims were allowed to do this, it was always a little sort of unclear that they should be allowed to do it. So a lot of them are chartered directly from the Sultan. So instead of having your normal deed, instead you have a document from the Sultan that says, Surp Giragos in Diyarbakir is in fact a vakif, and these revenue-generating properties will in perpetuity be given over to Surp Giragos. I, the Sultan, decree it so. Both of these things, whether a decree from the Sultan or being chartered in the name of a saint, are different from the way that the normal Islamic vakifs are chartered. During the Ottoman Empire, who cares? The Sultan said it, it's good. The Sultan told me I can have a vakif. Who's going to argue with the Sultan? Who's going to argue with the current Sultan's granddad, who was also the Sultan? You going to do it? I don't think so. You're fine. Well, what happens? The Ottoman Empire falls apart. The Republic of Turkey is founded, and now a sultan's decree doesn't really mean much at all. Ataturk, in fact, famously abolishes the caliphate. He drives out the last Ottoman sultan. So if the sultan gave you a piece of paper saying you're allowed to do this, it doesn't really count for much anymore. So a number of things happened. During the genocide, obviously, there was a huge loss of property. Huge loss of life, of course. But as we see also, we saw these ruins, right? Also a huge loss of property. In the provinces, sometimes things were just destroyed, but often the Young Turks, and this is a number of recent books have come out detailing this really sort of in detail, but also almost painful detail. One is called The Spirit of the Laws. There's a couple of really great books about how the Young Turks used the legal process to basically expropriate, to steal Armenian properties during the genocide. So this is one thing that happens. During the genocide, a lot of these properties are taken away through legal means. Once the Republic of Turkey is founded, they say, okay, look, we're going to keep this weird Islamic category, we're going to create a ministry of foundations, and we're going to group them all together, and I guess these weird non-Muslim Vakif foundation things, we'll let them stay. But, you know what? They need to register them. In fact, everybody, the Muslims too, they should register them. Because the Turkish state was interested actually, because property equals money, right? The Turkish state was interested in getting property in order to take care of its new government, in order to build the new Turkish state. And also there was sort of Sufi orders were kind of seen as weird and kind of subversive. So it was a way of getting the kind of heterodox Islamic sects under order as well. It wasn't just directed at non-Muslims. But when they were asked to register them, in 1935 specifically, they ran into some trouble. Any thoughts? Well, so some of them are gone. Some of them have been expropriated in other ways already. Some of them have been destroyed. Let's say my church is still in good standing. Most of my apartment building is still in good standing. And I'm asked to register this.
Pay a tax.
Taxes, yep.
Past taxes.
Past taxes. Back taxes. April's still a little ways away. Well, remember, some of them were registered in the names of saints. So now when you're asked to re-register them under the legal regime of the new Republic of Turkey, what the heck are you supposed to say? Surp Asfazazin, the Holy Mother of God, is here to come to the court today to re-register her church's vakif. Some of them were given by decree of the Sultan. The Sultan's been kicked out of the country. Ataturk hates everything to do with the Sultan and the Caliphate. Here I have this piece of paper that says the Sultan told me I could do this. The Turkish court says, forget that. That means nothing to us. On top of that, one of the other problems that happened is that each of these individual vakifs were chartered in their own unique way. There's no uniformity between how they're run. So my little church over here might have a board of 5 people, which is, elected every 5 years, and you can serve for 2 terms and blah, blah, blah. And over here, it might just be actually, my son and grandson in perpetuity are just going to run this thing. However I chartered it, that goes. So when you're asked to bring these things in to register, well, maybe one person on the 15-person board kept all the documents in his house. And maybe that person left during the genocide. Where are these papers? Who knows? So when you go to register in 1935, Armenians and other non-Muslims run into all kinds of problems. In the following year, in 1936, which are called here, you see the 1936 declarations, they basically use the lists that were gathered in 1935 as the basis for kind of reorganizing all of the foundations, and if you didn't have the right papers, the state took your property. And as we just saw, a lot of the non-Muslim Armenian foundations didn't have the right papers. Holy Mother of God, save us. But you can't come to court. I'm not going to go into the details of the Treaty of Lausanne. A lot of this is about this moment of transition from the Ottoman Empire to the Republic of Turkey is really interesting legally. It's really problematic in a lot of ways. It sets the parameters for what becomes the Armenian minority. right? To go from this millet, remember we talked about millet before? To a national minority is a major legal change. I think I died here. I guess I just can't talk because wander around as much.
It's not very.
I do have a loud voice, it's true. I'll just be here. So I won't go into all the details of the Treaty of Lausanne and some of these other things, but what I put this up here for is to note that under the treaty, the international treaty that establishes the Republic of Turkey, Armenians move from this kind of dhimmi millet into a minority, a national minority. And they're given rights that are supposed to be respected, including property rights. Not all of these are respected, okay? And the other part is that while they were in some ways respected, there were also all these sort of sneaky legal things that the Turkish Republic did in order to get these Armenian properties anyways. Okay, so the title of this recent book, The Spirit of the Law, is in part a play on the idea that they were not following the spirit of the law. Often both the genocidal policies and these later property expropriations followed the letter of the law. They found a way to sort of write laws that made it work, right? Oh, well, we're sorry, but the Holy Mother of God cannot appear in court today, so we're going to have to take your property. Well, that's sure, that's the letter of the law, but it's not the spirit of the law. So today, this way. So today, there are what are all of these non-Muslim foundations, oh, I'm not supposed to move as much now, all of these non-Muslim foundations, which were registered, so a lot of them now are lost. A lot of these properties are expropriated. The other thing to say about this is that in Istanbul, especially, in the provinces, all kinds of awful things happen. But in Istanbul, when we say that the properties were expropriated, remember vakif can mean both the revenue-generating property and, say, the church itself. Usually the churches were not taken. Okay, the state didn't take the churches or destroy the churches, but what they did take was the revenue-generating property. Okay, so they took my apartment building and all the rent that comes with it, but they left my church there. All of those vakifs, those foundations which did survive, were collected under this now, you can see, I put this up there just to show you the brilliance of Turkish bureaucracy here. This is the flow chart of the Ministry of Foundations, which administers all of these vakifs, not just the non-Muslim ones, but all of them. Okay? And within the category, even for Muslim vakifs, there's a number of different legal categories. We're not going to go into it, but there's different kinds of vakifs for Muslims. All of them that are non-Muslim get grouped together in what are called Cemaat vakiflar, which means community foundations, which I find very euphemistic. It's the non-Muslim foundations, but they call them the community foundations. And can we even find it on here? No. In 2008, so for most of the 20th century, most of the Republic of Turkey, all of these community foundations, grouped together in one area, had no representation in the Ministry of Foundations. This entire thing. In 2008, they reorganized the Ministry of Foundations, and they created the position for one person out of all the non-Muslim foundations. This includes Armenians, Greeks, Jews, Assyrians, Syriacs, all the non-Muslim foundations. One person got one spot on this board. And that's in 2008. The first person to hold this position, Laki Vingas, from the Greek community, a real interesting, upstanding guy, a lawyer by training, who's a perfect fit for it. He did a great job of working with the Armenian churches, and actually in a very sort of George Washington move, he stepped down after 2 terms. People loved him. They said, Laki, keep doing this. You're doing a great job. And he said, no, the Armenians have learned how to work with us. I think the Greeks need to learn how to work with an Armenian, maybe. And so actually today, the person sitting on this board is an Armenian. But again, this is one person out of about a couple hundred minority foundations spanning multiple different communities. See, I had so much about that. That's good. I didn't read all that. It's much better to talk about my awful son that I only gave 2% to instead. So where are we today, legally? Where does this stand? In 2008, there was this rearrangement that put one person on the board. And in 2011, right? 11, there was an announcement that some of these properties that were confiscated over the 20th century, largely in 1936, right? Remember the 35, they were forced to declare, didn't have the right paperwork. They took a bunch of them in 1936 and later. In 2011, then at the time, Prime Minister Erdogan announced that a lot of those revenue-generating properties, these apartment buildings and things, were going to be given back. Now this is huge, right? Because let's say I have my church. My church is still standing. But if you've taken away all 15 of the apartment buildings whose rent helps to pay for the upkeep of the church, the property taxes, the priests, the doorkeeper, the deacons, the oil for the candles, where's that money come from? Right? So by stealing, by appropriating the revenue-generating property, you cut the knees out from under the churches. So you don't take the churches, but you make them financially, insoluble, basically. So to announce in 2011 that you're going to return some of those apartment buildings and revenue-generating properties is major, right? The implications for the Armenian community is huge, because it means that you can start paying your priests again. Thanks, guys. I'm sure you appreciate that, right? We can pay it again. We got those apartment buildings back. Now, unfortunately, a lot of these were returned, but a lot of them were not. In part for the same reasons that they were expropriated in the first place in 1936. Well, not having the right kind of documentation. So they were given a really short amount of time. They said, all right, hey, cool, we're going to give you these back, but you have until about April 15th to gather all of your documents for the past 100 years and present them to us, and if you get all your paperwork in 100% tip-top, chip-shop order, then we'll give you your property back. And no, the Holy Virgin Mary may not appear in court. So, while some of the properties were returned after this, not all of them were. I want to be clear that this was a good thing, right? I mean, giving these properties back is a good thing. Let's be honest about that. The Turkish state did a good thing in doing that. It was not completely effective. It was not as good as a lot of people had hoped it was or thought it was going to be. This is where we stand today. There were a couple other kinds of weird issues that have happened. I won't get into that. We could talk about that. The Kurdish issue in the east. A number of things happened that made this more complicated for certain ones. Now, Vakifs largely are, of the Armenian Vakifs, most of them are churches, right? So again, when I say the Vakif, right, both the revenue generating and the object. Most of those objects are churches. Not all of them are. They include schools. Okay, so there are a number of active Armenian schools in the city still today. Some of them are really, really wonderful. Again, Tronagan I would put up there with any other Armenian school in the diaspora anywhere. One of the great Armenian schools. Okay? Schools. There's still a couple orphanages, and hospitals, cemeteries, all kinds of things. So this is a map of some of the other foundations. Specifically, what do we have? Hospitals and schools. And if we looked at the other map, you'll see that actually a lot of them are in the same places as the churches. And actually, one of the things that makes the Vakifs weird and complicated is that these bundles often include multiple things. So I've mentioned Surp Vartanants and Ferikoy. Surp Vartanants is a church. It's a Vakif. It's a church. It's also a school. Okay, it also includes a number of other buildings on the premises. Okay, so this is part of why we'll see that these are basically in the same place. So this includes cemeteries. There's another cameo, and actually the photographer is in the audience too as well. And hospitals. I'm going to dwell for just a minute on this hospital here, which is called Surp Pergic Holy Savers Armenian Hospital. It is the largest and the wealthiest of all the Armenian Vakifs in the city. It is a hospital. This is something that is sort of weird. I had this conversation actually at the hospital one day with this young man, and he was like, well, but what about the Armenian hospitals in America? And I was like, that's not really, we don't have, that's not how it works here. Like, we don't, I was sort of taken aback. Like, he thought it was really odd that we didn't have Armenian hospitals, and I was sitting there thinking that it was really odd that there was like an Armenian hospital. That's kind of weird. But it's a very important and old foundation. It was founded, and let me make sure I get it right, in 1834 by a wealthy Armenian from what was called the Amira class, Bestian. And it started actually out as a kind of like a more like a psychological, theological even, you know, I mean the ideas of what healing were sort of changing in the 19th century. And today actually is one of the most like successful hospitals in the country. Like in terms of like, you look at surgery rates, you know, I mean all the markers that tell you what a good hospital is, it's one of the best hospitals in the country. It doesn't serve only Armenians, in part because it's one of the best hospitals in the country. If you can pay for it, you're going to go here. It's a great, and a lot of the people that work there are Armenian. So you have Armenian surgeons and things like that that are working at this Armenian hospital that cater to not only Armenians, because it's so good, people want to go there and they're happy to pay for it. Okay? I bring this up because it's different from the churches. It's a different kind of example of a vakif, and because it's such a major player. It's the wealthiest, and also because one of the interesting things about it is that it's been successful in its legal battles. Even before the 2011 promised return of property, these guys, because they're heavyweights, threw their weight around and took the Turkish state to the European Court of Human Rights over one of their properties. A major revenue-generating property in the Taksim area, which is this kind of the hip European part of the city where a lot of the shopping happens. They had it's called the VGM building, and it was a really, oh, did I have it wrong now? The IGS, that's the other one. Too many acronyms. Anyways, a kind of major property right in the heart of the commercial center of the city, and they wanted that property back because that's some of the best rents in the city, and some of the best property in the city. And they took the government to the European Court of Human Rights, and actually they won that case before these promised other things happened. So these guys were sort of canaries in the coal mine for the possibility of winning back some of these properties. So that's why I put them up here. They continue to be mired in other legal battles. I guess this has the neighborhood around the hospital. There's a property that they seem to have won back, but the municipality isn't giving it back to them. So they're still mired in other legal battles, but I bring them up because they demonstrate the possibility of winning these legal battles for these really important properties. Okay, again, how do you fund the church other than, passing the plate around if you've been, had your knees chopped off and all of these revenue-generating properties are not there? So control over the revenue-generating properties is crucial to the health of the Armenian community. Because, again, churches, but hospitals, orphanages, schools, all of these things are funded by these vakifs. Every collective, communal thing that Armenians do in the city of Istanbul is in some way funded by a vakif. If it's an Armenian community thing, it probably gets money from a vakif. There's a few exceptions. Newspapers, there's a couple new foundations, but for the most part, funding for Armenian community things comes from these vakifs.
Like the cemeteries?
The cemeteries, yep. All of the upkeep of all of this kind of stuff is funded through vakif property. So this is why this is important, and this is why I bring in the legal battle. Now,
When they were confiscated, were they taken, were they held by the Turkish government, or were they privatized and sold to private?
Some both, actually. So this
How
was.
do they get those back then?
So in some cases, the government, in a similarity to kind of eminent domain, the government sort of said, "Hey, we're trying to do this good thing. We're going to buy you back at current market rate or whatever." So there were, but this is also part of why it was hard, because the ones that the government held, it's easy for the government to say, "We'll give these back to you," but the ones that had been sold, passed through multiple hands, that's a lot harder. So yes, both. Some were still held by the government, some were held in private hands, and this is another one of the things that made the return of them complicated. Yeah. Right, if you own this and this is this great revenue generating property in the heart of the city, you're not like, I'm not giving this to this Armenian hospital. Why would I do that, right? So one of the other interesting things about this hospital, it was built in 1834, and on the grounds, on the property of the church, or of the hospital, was built this little church, this little chapel. Also called Turkish, Holy Saviors. Beautiful little thing. It's connected to some of the most important sort of names in Armenian history. One of them you can't really see in the background of all of these robes. There are some, here you can see some of the tombstones a little bit. Gulbenkians, some Gulbenkians are buried right there. So this is, again, to just sort of point out the prominence of this site and its importance. But what's also sort of interesting is that there's a church here. So this is going to lead us back to our other theme of liturgy. We've been on the property theme for a little while. So, all right, this is a hospital that has a church on the grounds. Who administers the church? Who's in charge of the church? So there is the Vakif board. So yes, the board of the hospital is in charge of making sure that the church building, in this case, stays up, because it's part of the Surpurgij Vakif. What makes it a church? The liturgy, partially, right? I mean, arguably, we could say church is the physical building, the property, plus doing liturgy. There's some other things, maybe some people. There should probably be some people there. And the specifics of the architecture. We recognize something that looks like an Armenian church as having a specific kind of architecture. But if you've got the property, the physical church, and the liturgy, you've got a church, definitely. Because if you're doing liturgy, you've got at least a couple people there. Priest and a deacon, maybe. So, this hospital administers it, pays for it. Where does the priest come from?
Patriarchate.
From the Patriarchate. The Patriarchate has to send you a priest. Now, one of the interesting things about Istanbul is that, for weird legal reasons, the Patriarchate is not a Vakif. All of the individual churches are Vakifs. The Patriarchate is not. This leads to some really weird things that have happened. One of the churches I spent some time at, there was a fight, an actual fight, between the head of the Vakif and the priest. And so the Patriarchate responded by not sending a priest for several months, because they are not in charge of the property. The Patriarchate can't do anything, so these people, they continue to meet and have meals and do all these other things at this church, but there was no liturgy for several months because the Patriarchate didn't send them a priest. It's the only thing the Patriarchate could do. They couldn't close the church. They couldn't say, don't go there, because they don't run it. But they could say, well, you don't get a church or a priest until you figure this out. Maybe say you're sorry. It was really bizarre. It was a really weird time. So, in this case, this really powerful, wealthy Vakif has this little church on its property that the Patriarchate sends a priest to. And there's Badarak here regularly. When I was there, it was Mondays. I don't know if it still is, probably. Every Monday you could go to Badarak at this nice little church. Now, to show you how kind of weird and intertwined all of this stuff gets, in 1832, when the church was founded, or when the hospital was founded, it was founded on Hamparsum, okay, the Feast of the Ascension, because you did important things back then connected to the liturgical calendar. Okay, so if you're going to do something important, like, inaugurate this awesome, beautiful, huge hospital, why not do it on one of the 5 major feast days of the Armenian Church? So to this day in Istanbul every year, on the Feast of the Ascension, in the morning, everybody, and I mean everybody, all of the priests, both of the bishops who reside in the city, as well as all of the board, and this Bedros Sheklian, who is head of the board, is one of the wealthiest and most important Armenians in the city. He's the head of this wealthy and important Vakif. Makes him kind of important. Yes. Come and do Badarak in the morning, and then in the evening everybody comes back and you have a really giant, like 300-person banquet. So this sort of demonstrates this weird kind of connection between the Vakif as this property and the liturgical aspect of it. Okay, every year on Hampartsum, you celebrate Hampartsum there. That's just where you go. There's no priest anywhere else. They're all in a line there doing Antastan. So, at this little church, there was often liturgy. As I said, usually on Mondays, some other days. So I'm not going to spend too much time with the music, but I want to end by moving us back to where we started. Right? If you recall at the very beginning, we had me getting some music lessons when the call to prayer begins, and my nice, very talented music instructor saying, "Ah, Bushter, don't worry about it, we're going to keep going." Now, what is interesting about that is that, as I said, it was kind of harmonious. It kind of went together. Part of why, and I'm going to do this briefly, and we can talk about it more. Part of why that is true has to do with the music of the liturgy. So, in the Armenian church, there were lots of different kinds of songs. We tend to call all of them sharagans. That's not quite accurate. It's a specific category of a hymn that is a sharagan. We often use sharagan just to mean hymn. But a sharagan is a specific category of hymn. And any of the hymns, any of the categories of hymns, but the sharagans in particular, are given different musical, what are called modes. Now, a mode is basically like a scale, but it's a little bit different. It's a musical building block, okay? And each of the sharagans is given in a different mode. This is like saying, you know, I played, you know, whatever, Chopin's Polonaise in D. Right? You give the scale, you give the musical tone. In the same way, each of the Armenian hymns can be given a mode designation. You know, how's it sound? And I've listed them here. We don't need to sort of, you know, it's there. I don't need to go through it. There's 8 of them. This connects to the way the liturgical calendar works. There's a really beautiful theology built in with all of this. But the musical modes sort of change, and different sharagans are given in different ones. So here's an example in, what did I say? In Tagen. Okay, so and actually we have another cameo, although he's not here, but his mother is here, of the singer. And so I've got all kinds of cameos today. It's good. Again, it's lovely to be home. It's very nice. So the melody is characteristic of this mode. And not only the sort of the patterns as in the scale, but modes also take on a kind of characteristic. So the kind of the turns and twists are also part of what make a mode special. It's not just the patterns of the notes, it's also the sort of twists and turns. Okay, so you hear this and you say, okay, this is the Mezasu is one of the kinds of sharagans, and if you are well trained, you have a better ear than I do, and you hear that, you would say, aha, of course, that's Tagen. Okay? I was giving you other examples of liturgy here. This is a weird order to put this, but I'll just show you other examples of liturgy since we're doing it, and then we'll come back to some of the sharagans. We can hear some singing. So this is Samatia, one of the oldest churches. It was actually a Greek church that the Sultan gave to the Armenians. So it's one of the oldest Armenian churches, but it was not originally an Armenian church. That was a different church. So let's come back to Surpurgish to sort of close this out and think about, again, these kind of odd resonances that can help us think about what happens with this property and liturgy and the way that Armenians are sort of living in the city. So, as with most parts of Istanbul, even though this huge, right, we saw this huge complex, I'm not going to go back because otherwise I'll have to hear the things again, but the huge complex of the hospital, behind walls in the hospital, the church is kind of at one of the corners. So often after church we would sit around and we would drink tea and we would talk about things and we got a comped meal at the hospital, so we went and had our comped meal, and then we'd come back and drink some more tea, and then there was a free shuttle, so you waited for the free shuttle, so you had to drink a couple more teas so that you could take the free shuttle. And, as you're sitting around in the afternoon,
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar.
That's good enough. You would hear the call to prayer. Now, again, I'm going to come back to these sort of two real far possibilities. And I heard people in the city talk about it in either of these ways, right? This sort of harmonious one that we started with that says, you know what, don't worry about it, it's fine. And actually, yeah, it kind of sounds pretty together. We're just going to keep going. But then you also have this idea of a kind of acoustic domination on the other hand. Right? No matter where you are, no matter where you're sitting, at some point in time you're going to hear this. And people talked about it in these different kinds of ways. And what I want to kind of suggest is that these possibilities of kind of different ways of living are bound up in, obviously, the property, right? Because here we are, we're sitting on an Armenian property that has been funded by other Armenian properties, that is engulfed in legal battles, but that is tied up in the liturgy. And in fact, what is the point of supporting with my apartment complex a church? Well, we could do liturgy there, hopefully. Otherwise, what am I supporting the church for? So we're making these kinds of connections between these two. And the thing is that in this kind of musical interaction, I think we can hear a lot of different possibilities, right? We can hear the idea of an acoustic domination. But we can also hear these kinds of resonances and harmonies. And one of the most interesting things that ever happened to me in the city was sitting after church here at Surpurgic, and the call to prayer happened. And one of the people that I was sitting with did something really, really interesting to me. They asked the choir master there, who was like awesome, one of the most knowledgeable musicians in the city. She said, Hoja, is that Hijaz? And actually, I should take that back. What she actually said is that Tagen, which was to me even more surprising. Because Hijaz is the Turkish name, the Arabic Turkish name for a makam, for one of these modes. If we asked Richard right now, I'm sure he could sing us a taksim in Hijaz if we wanted to. Okay, it's a mode that is used in Turkish and Armenian and Middle Eastern folk music, as well as being a way of describing the call to prayer. And actually in Istanbul, the call to prayer is done at a different mode at different times of the day. In other parts of the Islamic world that's not true. But in Istanbul, each of the 5 is done in a different mode. So this person, they said, is that Tagen? Now what's weird about that? That's the Armenian mode. I didn't hear you. We had a right answer in the front too, I didn't hear it. That's an Armenian mode. So what this person was doing was hearing what many people had heard as acoustic domination. And instead sort of found her place liturgically in it. I want to point out that this is liturgical and it takes training, because you know what? I couldn't do that. I cannot hear the call to prayer and be like, oh yeah, that's Hijaz, that's this, and Hijaz is the same thing, it sounds about the same as Tagen. I can't do that. It takes deep musical and liturgical training to be able to do that. So to engage with the city in this really interesting way requires a deep engagement with the liturgy, sort of built up from the foundations of the property. So just to end, I will put this and see. So it's okay. I've been informed by a very qualified Armenian musician that I picked a bad example to do that with. So one day I will fix it and it will sound even better. But I think you can hear the resonances there. And so, with this final harmony, I hope that I've helped you hear with some clarity the complex themes composing the melody of Armenian life in Turkey today. We often hear only noise, or the most cacophonous ideas. about Armenians in Turkey. And I don't want to suggest that it's like paradise. Obviously, there's a lot of problems still. Hrant Dink was shot dead on the street, barely a decade ago. But if we listen carefully, we can hear something more complex, more complete, and I believe something more interesting. Armenians in Turkey, as a historical and often persecuted religious minority, can help us understand the problems facing minorities around the world. Okay, they're a really interesting minority. We can use it to think about minority rights in other places. Then, the tune becomes not just a nationalist march or a romantic pastoral, but it becomes a rich, resonant song. Thank you.